The Yorkshire Ripper was the most prolific and feared serial killer in British history. His crimes against women gripped West Yorkshire and beyond for a period of over 5 years, and the police investigation was the largest and most expensive ever mounted. Some say that there have been worse serial killers, but I will show that the level of his brutality and the callous and sadistic nature of his attacks went further than anyone before or since. And I find it utterly unbelievable that I left my old home city, London, scene of the infamous Jack the Ripper crimes, and I moved to Yorkshire only to find that another Ripper had been on the rampage in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This is the story of Peter Sutcliffe. But before I give you all the terrible details, let me welcome you to Utterly Unbelievable. Are you fascinated by true crime mysteries and the weird and wonderful? I know I am. So if you are too, you're in the right place. Here at Utterly Unbelievable, I delve into the most chilling of true crimes, try to fathom out the most baffling of the mysterious and strange events, and sink my teeth into anything weird and wonderful in the hope of bringing you a little of something that you like. So if you like what you see, please let me know so I can see what you like. And if you don't want to miss out on future videos, you might want to consider subscribing and turning on notifications. So get ready to dive into the world of mystery, intrigue and crime. Between 1975 and 1980, West Yorkshire was in the grip of terror. And on at least 2 occasions this terror crossed the Pennines into areas of Manchester. A serial killer was on the loose and 13 women were viciously murdered, and there were 7 attempted murders. To begin with, these attacks took place in residential areas, but they soon migrated into red light districts, and this prompted police to focus on prostitutes, that vulnerable group, as the possible main targets of the killer. Eventually, after approximately 5 years, this killer would be identified as Peter Sutcliffe. During the 5-year period, in a nod to the old Victorian serial killer, he was nicknamed the Yorkshire Ripper. Now, Sutcliffe was born in Bingley, West Yorkshire in 1946. Bingley at that time was a typical industrial West Yorkshire town. He was the eldest of 6 siblings. His father and mother worked, and his father was involved in the community playing cricket and football, and he also sang in a choir. What a lot of people did not know is that John Sutcliffe, the father, was also an abusive alcoholic who abused both his wife and his children. He would regularly beat his children with his belt, and on one occasion he assaulted the 5-year-old Peter Sutcliffe, who had inadvertently sat in his place at the Christmas dinner table. He hit Peter over the head with a beer glass. The young Peter, at 4 years old, was sent to a Roman Catholic primary school. And being a very small child, he was regularly bullied by the other bigger children. Overall, we get the impression of Peter as a small, weak child. Far from being the strong older brother, he was characterised by his own father as a wimp, who was always hanging on the apron strings of his mother, Kathleen. Peter doted upon his mother and thought she was perfect, and in return Kathleen lavished him with attention, probably more so than the other children. Unfortunately, this perfect image of his mother would become sullied later. Kathleen cheated on her husband John, and John, in a fit of rage, lured her to a meeting, posing as her lover, and effectively outed her in front of young Peter and his siblings. Can we imagine the effect this must have had on the young Peter? His perfect mother no longer perfect in his eyes. Would this affect his future attitude towards women and fuel his crimes against them? Who knows? As an adolescent, Peter was considered a loner. He left school at 15 and went through a series of menial jobs, including 2 stints as a gravedigger in Bingley Cemetery. He developed a macabre sense of humour and was renowned among his workmates for playing horrible pranks, sometimes using body parts that he'd taken from corpses. He also regularly volunteered for extra shifts to wash the corpses prior to their interment, so he obviously had an affinity with death and the dead. After these stints at the cemetery, He went through a couple of factory jobs, eventually taking redundancy and using his redundancy pay to procure a course to learn to be a heavy goods vehicle or HGV driver. And this set the course for his future career, a lorry driver in and around the areas of West Yorkshire. In October 1976, Peter Sutcliffe found work as a driver for T&WH Clark Holdings Limited. He was based at the Canal Road Industrial Estate in Bradford. He did very well at this job, gaining the trust and respect of his workmates. He remained in this position during his killing years. He met his future wife, Sonia Surma, who was of Ukrainian and Polish descent, in a pub in the red light district in Bradford. They married in 1974 and bought their first house at 6 Garden Lane, Heaton in 1977. Sonia herself had a bad temper and was sometimes known to slap Peter around the face. She was also later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and Peter would sometimes have to calm her down after dealing with her outbursts. Sutcliffe was still living in the property at 6 Garden Lane in later years when he was eventually found and arrested. It's rumoured that Peter himself sometimes sought the services of prostitutes, and again this may have made his obsession with them worse. He had already developed a liking for voyeurism and regularly used to follow prostitutes in the red light districts once they had found a client, and he would indeed watch them in the act, so to speak. We don't actually know for a fact whether Peter had bad experiences with them, but 2 stories tell of him being swindled out of some money by a prostitute and her pimp, and on another occasion, when he was unable to follow through with the sexual act, he was humiliated in public by another prostitute. Did this fuel his hatred? Did this make him want to carry out the future crimes? Again, we don't know. Peter Sutcliffe's reign of terror is thought to have begun in 1969, and this centred around the prostitute who possibly owed him some money, maybe the same prostitute who had swindled him out of the money along with her pimp. He was out one night with his friend Trevor Birdsall in Trevor's vehicle, and they were in St Paul's Road, Bradford. At one point, Sutcliffe leapt out of the vehicle, having seen a woman he thought was the one he was looking for. He placed a rock or a half brick in a sock and proceeded to assault the woman with the rock inside the sock. He hit her with such force that the rock itself busted out of the toe of the sock. He then ran back to Trevor's van and they drove off, but not before the prostitute herself had seen the registration plate, and she was later able to report it to police. The following day, Sutcliffe was traced and spoken to by police. On this occasion, he was told that he was very lucky because the prostitute had declined to press charges. Now, after this, there appears to have been an apparent lull in Sutcliffe's activity until 1975. We don't know for sure whether he was completely inactive because there were a plethora of attacks against women between 1969 and 1980, the nature of which could have been characterised as being Sutcliffe's work. However, conjecture aside, we are certain that his next attack was on 36-year-old Anna Regulski. This was in July 1975, and Sutcliffe attacked her as she was walking through the dark streets of Keighley. She was brutally hit from behind with a hammer, and then her stomach was slashed open with a knife. A neighbour heard the commotion and rushed out, and Sutcliffe fled the scene, leaving her really badly injured but alive. In August of the same year in Halifax, he attacked 46-year-old Olive Smelt. She was once more hit with a hammer, but this time had her lower back slashed with a knife. She later informed Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, one of the investigating officers, that her assailant had a Yorkshire accent, but at this stage this was completely ignored. The reason it was ignored was that she was not walking in a red light district. That same month, we need to picture ourselves in a dark country lane in Silsden. This time a much younger victim, 14-year-old Tracy Brown. She apparently walked a short way with Sutcliffe and felt at ease with him, but then he attacked her again with a hammer. This time he was disturbed by the headlights of a passing car and again fled, leaving her badly injured. We can only imagine the effect that this had on such a young person. She was lucky to get away with her life. And this sets the scene leading up to the later crimes. At this stage, none of the attacks were in red light districts, but this was soon to change. The first of Sutcliffe's murder victims was 28-year-old Wilma McCann in October of that same year. Wilma McCann was killed within a stone's throw of her council house in Scott Hall Lane in the Chapeltown area of Leeds. She was the mother of 4 young children, and 2 of them were alarmed in the early hours of the morning when their mother had not returned home. They actually ventured out of the house to the local bus stop to wait for Mum to arrive. But unfortunately, she never did. A further terrible fact is that they passed the field where their dead mother laid, and it is perhaps fortuitous that they did not themselves discover her body. Now, moving on to January 1976, Sutcliffe's next victim was 42-year-old Emily Jackson. Now, during this time, lots of people were suffering financially. Jackson and her husband were no strangers to this, and so they had decided that she would try and raise some extra money by prostitution. Having picked her up, Sutcliffe drove her to some local derelict buildings, where she was probably expecting to make some money performing sexual acts. Instead, she was brutally killed with hammer blows and no less than 52 stab wounds with a screwdriver. Her killer also stamped on her thigh, leaving a boot mark. This was maybe the first clue that police had. They now had his footwear and the size. The next attack victim was badly injured but survived. In May, 20-year-old Marcella Claxton was walking home at night through Roundhay Park. She accepted a lift from Sutcliffe, who she didn't know at all. Bearing in mind attacks against women had already happened, was this a little bit silly? Or was it just due to the fact that the previous attacks had not yet been widely publicised? And perhaps the police did not yet know that a serial killer was on the loose. As she got out of Sutcliffe's car, she too was attacked with a hammer and she suffered extensive brain trauma. At the time of the attack, she was also 4 months pregnant, and regrettably she lost the baby as well. Fast forward to February 1977. Irene Richardson, 28, was a prostitute in the Chapeltown area of Leeds. She was last seen on her way to a pub and disco in Leeds. Her body was found in Roundhay Park, where she had been murdered by being hit with a hammer and stabbed 31 times. After this, her body was further mutilated by her attacker. This time the police had another clue because tyre tracks were left at the scene, but this gave them an extensive list of vehicles to check. In April the same year, prostitute Patricia Atkinson Mitra was killed in her own home this time. She had been picked up by Sutcliffe and they'd gone back to her place, and again she was hit with the hammer, but this time stabbed 6 times. In addition to the attack that killed her, this time there was a sexual element involved because he pulled down her jeans and her panties and also exposed her breasts. Obviously these killings were terrible and bad enough, but in June things took a far worse turn. 16-year-old Jane MacDonald, who was nothing to do with the sex industry, was brutally murdered. She had been out in Leeds with friends, and having waited for a friend's sister to run her home, the sister never arrived, she elected to walk home alone in the dark. She was attacked by Sutcliffe in Reginald Street. She suffered terrible head injuries and stab wounds, and when she was found, a broken bottle had been rammed into her chest. When he subsequently gave his statement, Sutcliffe expressed remorse over the killing of Jane MacDonald because he found out that she was not a red light worker and that she was so young. But this marked a turning point in the killing. Up until now, the general public thought that only prostitutes were being targeted. They now found that anyone was a target. In July, another woman survived an attack. 43-year-old Maureen Long had been out on the town. She had been to the Mecca in Bradford, and when she came out, she accepted a lift from a stranger. This stranger happened to be Peter Sutcliffe. Again, perhaps we wonder why. With the increasing climate of fear and terror, why would a woman alone at night accept a lift from a stranger? Peter Sutcliffe assaulted her with a hammer, leaving her with traumatic head injuries. and then he left her. When she was found, she was also suffering from hypothermia. At one point, police thought they had a clue because a witness identified the type of car that the assailant had. Unfortunately, they identified the wrong type of vehicle. The next fatal victim was Jean Jordan, aged 20, also a prostitute. This time Sutcliffe crossed the Pennines to the Manchester area and she was murdered in Chorlton. She was hit approximately 11 times with a hammer, but this time Sutcliffe made his first error. He had hired her for sex and paid her with a brand new £5 note. After he had murdered her and left the scene, he realised that the £5 note may be traceable. He in fact returned to the murder scene. Her body was still there and he was trying to find the £5 note, but he failed to do so because it was in a hidden compartment in her handbag. In a fit of rage when he couldn't find the £5 note, he stripped her body and further mutilated it, and indeed tried to decapitate it with a hacksaw blade. A few days later, her body was found by a dairy worker called Bruce Jones, who would later find fame in Coronation Street, the soap opera. The £5 note was the police's first real clue. It is significant because it was subsequently traced to a Midland bank in West Yorkshire, which dispersed payroll to various companies around the county. The field was narrowed to about 8,000 employees of these companies, 5,000 of whom were interviewed. One of them was Sutcliffe. This was the first interview out of an utterly unbelievable 9 times by police prior to his arrest. In December, another prostitute survived an attack. Marilyn Moore, 25, was assaulted with a hammer in the back of Sutcliffe's car in Scott Hall, Leeds. As he was attacking her, Sutcliffe overbalanced, and although badly injured, Moore managed to escape from the car and escaped with her life. More tyre tracks were found at the scene, and so this was another clue for the police. And Moore actually provided a good description of Peter Sutcliffe's car, which coincided with one which had been seen in red light districts, and this led to a further interview for Peter Sutcliffe. In January of 1978, police discontinued the investigation regarding the £5 note, and although Peter Sutcliffe had been interviewed on a number of occasions, he was now discounted by the Ripper squad as a suspect. So here we have a man who's now been interviewed by the police on several occasions. He has clues pointing towards him, like for example his car being regularly seen in the red light district, and also being the possible recipient of a £5 note found at a murder scene, and yet still the police discount him. Is this absolutely mind-boggling? Police would later say that the volume of information that they had, and remember this is pre-computers folks, was contained in card indexes which were cross-referenced. And basically the system was just not up to the task. In fact, there were so many cards involved in the investigation, the floor of the investigation room at the Millgarth police station had to be reinforced. There were literally thousands upon thousands of them. Now that same month, Sutcliffe murdered Bradford prostitute Yvonne Pearson, aged 21. He hit her with a hammer and then jumped on her chest with his full weight, so the full force of his weight coming down on her chest. He then stuffed her mouth full of horsehair from an old sofa that was lying nearby. He then hid her dead body under that same sofa. By this time, his confidence and brutality were both peaking, showing the true extent of his sadistic nature. 10 days later, the next murder took place in Huddersfield this time. 18-year-old Elena Ritker was hit with a hammer, stripped and then stabbed. During a later police interview, Sutcliffe said that at this time he had the urge to kill any woman and it was unstoppable. In May, a 40-year-old prostitute, Vera Millward, was killed in Chorlton-on-Medlock. She was initially picked up by Sutcliffe as she went out to buy some cigarettes. As she got out of his car, she was hit with a hammer, dragged to a fence and stabbed multiple times. Now moving forward to 1979, April to be specific, Sutcliffe preyed on 19-year-old Josephine Whittaker as she walked home in Halifax. She again was hit with a hammer and this time stabbed 21 times in various areas of her body, including her genitals. Her skull was viciously fractured all over. literally from ear to ear. At this point, a wild card entered this whole episode. This was in the form of a hoaxer claiming to be the Ripper. Subsequently nicknamed Wearside Jack because of his Wearside or Sunderland accent, this hoaxer sent a cassette tape recording to Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, who at the time was leading the Ripper squad.
The only time they came near catching me was a few months back in Chapeltown when I was disturbed. I warned you in March that I'd strike again. Sorry it wasn't Bradford. I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again, but it will be definitely sometime this year. I'm not sure where. Maybe Manchester. I like it there. There's plenty of them knocking about. They never learn, do they, George? I bet you've warned them, but they never listen. Well, it's been nice chatting to you, George. Yours, Jack the Ripper.
This man, who was later identified as John Humble, also sent letters to the Daily Mirror and police, at least 2 of them. He signed his letters Jack the Ripper. He also claimed that he'd murdered a 26-year-old woman called Joan Harrison in Preston in 1975. Now, the Wearside Jack hoax was a considerable stumbling block in the police investigation because it sent it in completely the wrong direction. This was in part due to the fact that George Oldfield and other senior officers on the Ripper squad believed that the tape and the letters were genuine. It took police over 25 years to identify the Wearside hoaxer. At one point he was arrested on a totally unrelated matter. He gave a DNA sample, and then later he was identified from DNA found on one of the envelopes of a letter sent to the police. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. Do you think this was too lenient, bearing in mind his hoax could have contributed to many more murders? Let me know in the comments below. And so the murders continued. In September, a Bradford University student, Barbara Leach, aged 20, was murdered. Barbara Leach was killed and dumped under a pile of bricks near to the university. Now, this killing of a further non-sex worker spread terror on the streets of West Yorkshire cities and beyond. Women were advised strongly not to venture out on their own at night, and some began to even suspect members of their own families, like husbands or brothers or other family members, if they were out on the nights when the murders occurred. A massive publicity campaign was mounted on the basis of the Wearside Jack tape and letters, but of course this would go nowhere because it was a hoax. The only good thing about the publicity campaign was perhaps the fact that it would raise awareness of what was going on and perhaps keep some ladies off the streets at night. Sutcliffe was investigated and interviewed by police on at least 2 further occasions in 1979. There were forensic clues possibly linking him to the series of murders, and he was one of the possible 300 recipients of the £5 note. But yet again he went under the radar. That's utterly unbelievable. Now, in June of the next year, 1980 to be specific, Sutcliffe was arrested for drink driving. In August he was still awaiting trial when he killed civil servant Marguerite Walls, aged 47. He rained hammer blows onto her head, reportedly yelling "filthy prostitute." He then moved her up a drive into a high-walled garden with a length of rope around her neck. He basically put the rope around her neck and dragged her up the drive. After this, he knelt with his full weight on her chest and choked her. Another sexual element comes in here. When he was satisfied that she was actually dead, he removed all of her clothing bar her tights. He then covered her with grass and leaves and fled the scene. In September that same year, another woman survived an attack. This was 34-year-old Apadya Bandara. She was a 34-year-old doctor from Singapore. She was assaulted in Headingley in Leeds, and again she was hit with a hammer, rendering her unconscious. Sutcliffe placed a rope around her neck, but he was disturbed this time by something unknown. So he dragged her along the street for a little way, using the rope, and then let her go and fled the scene. In October, there was another survivor, this time a Leeds University student, Maureen Lee, aged 21. She was attacked in a dark street in Chapeltown as she headed for the bus stop. Sutcliffe punctured her skull at the back with a sharp object. He then fractured her skull, cheekbone and jaw. She eventually awoke in hospital, and one can only assume that Sutcliffe was again disturbed in some way during the commission of this evil act. Teresa Sykes, aged 16, was another survivor. She was on her way to a local shop in Huddersfield when Sutcliffe attacked her. Teresa's boyfriend heard her scream and cry out, and he ran out to assist her. This in turn caused Sutcliffe to run from the scene. The final murder victim was another Leeds University student. Jacqueline Hill, aged 20, was hit with a hammer and stabbed as she returned to her hall of residence in Headingley. The stab wounds were administered with a screwdriver, and Sutcliffe removed all of her clothing in addition. I'll just remind you that up to the time of this last murder, Sutcliffe had already been interviewed a total of 9 times and had still not been connected with the murders. As is often the case with serial killers, luck came to the rescue of the police investigation, bringing the terrible reign of the Yorkshire Ripper to an end. In January 1981, Sutcliffe had gone to Sheffield and picked up a 24-year-old prostitute called Olivia Reevers. He had parked his car in a suspicious fashion in a driveway, making it look as though he was ready for a quick getaway. The car was spotted by 2 South Yorkshire police officers who stopped to check him out. When probationary constable Robert Hyde did a vehicle check, Sutcliffe's car was found to be running with false number plates and he was arrested. During the arrest, Sutcliffe claimed that he had to pee, and so he was allowed to go behind an oil storage container. Unbeknown to the officers, whilst he was behind this container, he secreted a knife, a length of rope and a hammer that he had intended to use on his new victim. After this, he was transported to Dewsbury Police Station, where the questioning started regarding the Ripper cases. Sutcliffe was thought to match many of the photo fit pictures, and gut instinct took Sergeant Robert Ring back to the area of the arrest. After a brief search, he went behind the oil tank where Sutcliffe had gone to pee, and he found the knife, the rope and the hammer. In addition to this, whilst he was in custody at Dewsbury Police Station, Sutcliffe had asked to go to the toilet and had secreted a further knife in the cistern of the toilet. This was subsequently found, but it beggars belief that he was allowed to stay in the police station unsearched with a knife about his person. Sutcliffe was eventually strip searched at Dewsbury Police Station and was found to be wearing an inverted V-neck jumper on his lower body. The sleeves had been pulled up over his legs and the V-neck exposed his genital area. The padded elbows appeared to be protecting his knees, possibly when he was kneeling over his victims. The sexual connotations of the things that he was wearing left little to the imagination. Meanwhile, a warrant was obtained to search his house in Heaton, and his wife Sonia was brought in for questioning. When Sonia Sutcliffe was interviewed both at the time of Peter Sutcliffe's arrest and afterwards, she denied all knowledge of her husband's activities. Peter also stated that she had no knowledge of the murders. She appeared to remain loyal to him until she eventually divorced him in 1994. Sutcliffe was subjected to 2 days of intensive questioning, and then out of the blue, on the 4th of January, he admitted his crimes. Once the hammer, rope and knife had been discovered in Sheffield at the arrest site, Detective Inspector John Boyle, who was questioning Sutcliffe, said, "I think you're in trouble, serious trouble." Sutcliffe's response was, and I quote, "I think you're leading up to it. The Yorkshire Ripper. Well, it's me, and I'm glad it's over. I would have killed that girl in the car if I hadn't have been arrested." During the next 24 hours, he gave a calm, almost cold description of all of his crimes. I have here 2 direct quotes from Sutcliffe. The first one was, "The women I killed were filth." The second one was, "Bastard prostitutes were littering up the streets. I was just cleaning the place up a bit." A few weeks later, he would claim that God had spoken to him from a headstone in Bingley Cemetery and told him to kill prostitutes. The only victim that he appeared to express any remorse over was the young 16-year-old Jane MacDonald, who proved not to be a sex worker. So the Yorkshire Ripper had finally been caught, and he was charged with 13 counts of murder and 7 of attempted murder on the 5th of January 1981. Sutcliffe's trial took place in May, and he pleaded not guilty to murder, but guilty to manslaughter, claiming diminished responsibility. He was also reported to have pleaded guilty to 7 counts of attempted murder. 4 psychiatrists gave evidence and stated that Peter Sutcliffe suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, and based upon this, the prosecution were going to accept his plea. However, the judge, Justice Sir Leslie Boreham, was not happy with this, and he questioned the prosecution as to their reasoning. In the end, he rejected the evidence from the psychiatrists and determined that the trial would take place in front of a jury. This subsequently happened, and after a 2-week trial, the jury also rejected the psychiatrist evidence and convicted Sutcliffe on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life sentences. The judge stated that he hoped Sutcliffe would never leave prison, and he commenced his incarceration at Her Majesty's Prison, Parkhurst in 1981. In March 1984, he was then transferred to the Broadmoor Secure Hospital under the Mental Health Act. By 2009, Sutcliffe was reported to be fit to leave Broadmoor, and Sutcliffe proceeded with a number of appeals to try and set a date for his potential release. However, in 2010, he was handed a whole life order, which would mean that he would never be released. In 2015, he was deemed no longer mentally ill, and in 2016, he was transferred to Her Majesty's Prison, Frankland in Durham. Peter Sutcliffe suffered from a number of health issues, including diabetes, and having had a suspected heart attack, he returned to Frankland Prison in 2020. Subsequently, he was taken to hospital, having contracted COVID-19, for which he refused treatment, and he died in 2020. West Yorkshire Police came under intense criticism for their handling of the investigation of these murders. Sutcliffe had been interviewed a staggering 9 times during the period he committed his crimes, but he was rejected as a suspect. One could suggest that it was just blind luck that prevented him killing again when he was arrested in Sheffield. The Inspectorate of Constabulary Byford report, which was made after Sutcliffe was convicted and incarcerated, was also damning of West Yorkshire Police. It criticised the choice of George Oldfield as head of the Ripper Squad, and it highlighted the fact that Trevor Birdsall, Sutcliffe's friend, had sent a letter to the police and visited the police station stating that Sutcliffe was the Ripper, and this was ignored. The report also stated that West Yorkshire Police were woefully unprepared for the scale of the investigation. Perhaps the most poignant fact is the reaction of Detective Constable Andy Lapchew, who was one of the officers who investigated and interviewed Sutcliffe before he was arrested. He sensed there was something not right about Sutcliffe, and he said as much in his report to his superiors. This report was unfortunately ignored. When he heard that Sutcliffe had been arrested after 3 more murders, he stated that the bottom fell out of his world. I guess it's sad that he was not listened to, and that is also utterly unbelievable. The series of murders committed by Peter Sutcliffe was one of the most brutal killing sprees in British history, and our hearts go out to the families of all of the victims. So on that note, I would ask you to please stay curious and stay safe. And if by chance you happen to notice the pin badge that I was wearing part of the way through this video, please let me know below. The first correct answer will receive a mention in the next video. Thank you for watching.